Advanced Residential Applications and Case Studies. Chapter 2, Advanced Residential Appraisal Concepts, page 13. Scope of Work Rule. When an appraiser determines the scope of work for an appraisal assignment, how does the appraiser know that scope of work is appropriate? The scope of work rule provides two benchmarks. Both, that's highlighted, of these benchmarks must be met. Scope of work acceptability. The scope of work must include the research and analysis that are necessary to develop credible assignment results. Comment. The scope of work is acceptable when it meets or exceeds the expectations of parties who are regularly intended users for similar assignments, and what an appraiser's peers' actions would be in performing the same or a similar assignment. Determining the scope of work is an ongoing process in an assignment. Information or conditions discovered during the course of an assignment might cause the appraiser to reconsider the scope of work. An appraiser must be prepared to support the decision to exclude any investigation, information, method, or technique that would appear relevant to the client, another intended user, or the appraiser's peers. An appraiser must not allow assignment conditions to limit the scope of work to such a degree that the assignment results are not credible in the context of the intended use. Comment. If relevant information is not available because of assignment conditions that limit research opportunities, such as conditions that place limitations on inspection or information gathering, an appraiser must withdraw from the assignment unless the appraiser can modify the assignment conditions to expand the scope of work to include gathering the information or use an extraordinary assumption about such information if credible assignment results can still be developed. An appraiser must not allow the intended use of an assignment or a client's objectives to cause the assignment results to be biased. Sometimes clients place conditions on assignments that limit an appraiser's ability to gather the information they need to develop an appraisal or appraisal review. If this is the case, the appraiser has three options. Number one, expand the scope of work to include gathering the necessary information. Number two, use an extraordinary assumption about such information if credible results can still be developed. And number three, withdraw from the assignment. An appraiser is also required to disclose the scope of work in the appraisal report or appraisal review report. The scope of work disclosure requirements are also set forth in the scope of work rule. Disclosure obligations. The report must contain sufficient information to allow the client and other intended users to understand the scope of work performed. The information disclosed must be appropriate for the intended use of the assignment results. Comment. Proper disclosure is required because clients and other intended users rely on the assignment results. Sufficient information includes disclosure of research and analysis performed and might also include disclosure of research and analysis not performed. The appraiser has broad flexibility and significant responsibility in the level of detail and manner of disclosing the scope of work in the appraisal report or appraisal review report. The appraiser may, but is not required to, consolidate the disclosure in a specific section or sections of the report, or use a particular label, heading, or subheading. An appraiser may choose to disclose the scope of work as necessary throughout the report. Many appraisers choose to disclose their scope of work in a specifically identified section of the appraisal or appraisal review report titled Scope of Work or something similar. While disclosure in a specific part of the report is acceptable, it is not required by USPAP. Alternatively, an appraiser may disclose the scope of work little by little in various different places throughout the report. End of page. Page 14, Scope of Work Rule. When we finished our review of Standards Rule 1-2, we were to the point of having identified the appraisal problem, which corresponds to the first requirement of the Scope of Work Rule. The second requirement of this rule is to determine and perform the scope of work necessary to develop credible assignment results. This is an important point in the process of appraising a complex property. Your scope of work requirements may go well beyond that which is required of you in the appraisal of a typical property. You must apply your understanding to the appraisal problem as you have identified it in order to develop a scope of work that will result in a credible opinion. USPAP defines credible as credible, worthy of belief. Comment. Credible assignment results require support by relevant evidence and logic to the degree necessary for the intended use. When all is said and done, your scope of work, that is, your type and extent of research and analysis for the complex appraisal assignment must be sufficient to the point that you can demonstrate that your appraisal opinions and conclusions are worthy of belief. End of page.